In this series of mini lectures about the conservative movement in the United States, I've talked about Young Americans for Freedom, the moral majority, neoconservatives, even mentioning paleoconservatives, and now I'm up to an individual who is a pretty big giant in the conservative movement of the 20th century. This is going to be Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan really gets onto the stage nationally in the 1960s because he's going to campaign for Barry Goldwater. You remember Barry Goldwater ran against LBJ in 1964. And sometimes Goldwater is called Mr. Conservative. He is a senator from Arizona, and he is in his own right very important in this story. But I can't cover everything, so I'm going to focus instead on Reagan. Reagan was an actor for much of his career, and this is how he kind of makes money, and he rises to a position that he gets more and more and more interested in politics and how the United States is governed. He had been a New Deal Democrat. Ronald Reagan's hero was FDR. He absolutely loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he will often reference FDR as a politician because this was very sincere. Reagan was a Democrat for a great part of his life. He's beyond middle age when he changes political affiliations and he becomes a Republican, and he campaigns for Barry Goldwater. So why? A lot of it has to do with communism. So kind of like the neoconservatives, Reagan will go through a political evolution which is in some degree couched in his view of the Cold War. So regardless, in 1964, he is raising money for Barry Goldwater, and it's pretty obvious that LBJ is going to win at this point, but he gives something that people who care about political history refer to as the speech. Okay? If you're talking to someone who knows a lot about politics and you say the speech, they'll know you're talking about Reagan. And what was this all about? He gets on television and he is talking and he is smooth and he puts forth some principles in a way that people understand, and it's like, oh man, I wish that was our guy. Right? In fact, some people call Ronald Reagan the great communicator because he is such a good speaker. If you just listen to kind of the cadence of his voice, he knows how to present ideas. Well, Goldwater does lose, but now people are really interested in this guy who was an actor. Maybe he will become a politician, and that is what happens. He goes ahead and he runs for governor of California. He will serve as a governor for 2 terms, and during this period in his history, he will learn kind of the art of politics, the art of governing. After you win the election, you got to know how to govern. And Ronald Reagan is not going to be an ideologue. He's not going to be a guy who is so my way or the highway that he never reaches across the political aisle. He will. He will often do that. He will often play with some of his core values. He'll be the kind of guy who will give a little to take a lot, right? And this is actually, and sometimes to take a little. This is kind of how you have to be in our system. We're just set up that way. People have to learn how to compromise with one another, or you have just gridlock, which I think you guys have probably noticed for a lot of your lives, if you've paid attention to politics. So anyway, he learns about governance while the governor of a major state. And by 1976, you're going to have a situation in the Republican Party where you had the absolute horrendous situation with Watergate. Richard Nixon had resigned. Spiro Agnew, his vice president, had resigned as well in disgrace for something else. And Gerald Ford became president as a result. Gerald Ford is very strange because he never ran on a ticket, so no one ever voted for him to be president, and yet he rose up and there he was. And by 1976, he's made a lot of people mad because he pardoned Richard Nixon. Why did he do that? He did it because he just wanted the country to move on. He's like, why are we going to go through this giant trial with Nixon? We as a country have been torn apart, ripped apart. We've gone through just the horrendous social battles, and the fabric, the American fabric is ripping, and people no longer trust government, and it's all very bad, and we need to come together as a country again. And I don't think that putting a former president on trial will help us do that. So he pardons Richard Nixon and makes some people mad. Well, he doesn't make Republicans mad so much with that, but he makes some of them feel as if he is a little too moderate on some issues, that he is not very conservative-minded, and the conservative wing of the Republican Party will put Ronald Reagan forth in a primary challenge of Gerald Ford. And amazingly enough, Ronald Reagan, he's almost takes it. Like, he does a pretty good run. But as you know from Theodore Roosevelt's experiences, it is almost impossible to primary a sitting president. Our system just isn't, the political parties aren't set up that way. But even though Gerald Ford wins the nomination in 1976 and then will lose to Jimmy Carter in the general election, Ronald Reagan has again positioned himself to run in the primary for 1980 when he does win the Republican nomination, and he will then go on to beat Jimmy Carter in what is like a massive wampum, by the way. Jimmy Carter only wins 49 electoral votes, something really small like that. He wins his home state of Georgia and just 2 or 3 others. It's a pretty, it's dominant. But regardless, what was Ronald Reagan like about as he is becoming president? He hates communism. If you want to know one thing that you need to remember about this guy, above all other things, like he wants smaller government. He talks about cutting taxes. He does cut taxes. He talks about economic soundness. He wants to do things that make people have more control of their lives. He thinks that government is often the problem. But he doesn't like a lot of government spending. Ironically, the deficit will go up under Ronald Reagan because his primary focus is going to be defeating the communists. Everything else is secondary to that. Again, let me say this again. Ronald Reagan's primary focus is defeating the communists in the Cold War. That is the thing that animates him, much more than anything else, including lowering taxes or making government smaller or anything else like that. Okay? So Reagan will be a Cold War warrior, and he will be engaged in an arms race. He will be, many people think, very important in helping to end the Cold War. And when he leaves office 8 years later, many people will look back on him fondly. If you look at the electoral map in 1984, you kind of get the idea of how many people liked Reagan. I mean, he could inspire some big feelings, man. Like, some people really disliked Reagan, but he wins 49 out of 50 states in 1984. I don't know. That seems to me as if he had a pretty big endorsement from the people. Now, he does have scandal within his terms. In his second term, he has something called the Iran-Contra affair. This is definitely not something that is good. You need to look at that. That's also part of Cold War maneuvering. And I think very few other presidents could have really survived Iran-Contra, except for Reagan was so popular that it was hard to topple him because of that. Even though the law was actually broken in the Iran-Contra affair. There are some other scandals that are associated with his time in office. There's the AIDS epidemic, which rises up, which is worthy of note, especially since we're in the middle of this COVID pandemic. Some people think that Ronald Reagan did not act quickly enough to deal with the AIDS epidemic. Some people ascribe this to antipathy towards homosexuals, and I don't know. I think that that's rather unfair. If you look at Ronald Reagan's history, he comes from Hollywood. He is a Californian. In a lot of ways, he's very progressively minded as far as social issues like that are concerned. He doesn't, I mean, he's a guy who grew up in a much different time period, but he didn't, to give you an example, there was a politician in California who tried to pass a law that would make it impossible for a gay teacher to work in the public school system. And this ends up failing. It was a proposition on the ballot. And when he was asked why he failed, he said, you know, 2 words, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had lobbied to defeat this because Reagan thought that it was unjust. So when you look at the AIDS controversy, it's more complicated. Ronald Reagan is also the only president of the United States who had been the president of a labor union. and yet he takes on a labor union while he is president. And when you had a bunch of air traffic controllers who essentially made air travel ground to a halt, Reagan fired all of them. So he's often full of these weird contradictions. He doesn't like identity politics, but he appoints the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. I don't know. He's a figure who is worth remembering and going back and looking at. He's a transformational president because he changes the society much as his idol FDR had changed the society, though in different ways. And he's very optimistic and sunny. Like if you look at his second campaign, it was all about it's morning in America. So kind of stressing all of the goodness of being an American. In the 70s, the country was really down on itself. It had all sorts of issues. And by the 80s, you know, not every group, not everyone, there's still lots of problems, but people were starting to feel optimistic again. Like, oh, you know what? It's, USA, right? And yeah, we win the Cold War. Just if you didn't clue into that, we won.